Psychic Sexuality, The Biopsychic Anatomy of Sexual Energies by Ingo Swann, with a foreword by Paula Gunn Allen, PhD. Items to consider. It's unkind to point out the obvious to those who don't want to see it, but it's worse to point out the invisible to those convinced it doesn't exist. What, when, and who are important, of course, but meaning is only achieved by understanding the why. And which is one reason why the why it's hidden is hidden from easy access. Enthusiasm collects vital energies. This book is dedicated to the late and very great Zelda Suplee, free spirit, sexologist, social critic, universal earth mother, a soul of great wonderment and beauty. Forward. When Sir Arthur Conan Doyle via Sherlock Holmes commented that the world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observed, he had not been counting on people like Ingo Swann. For while Doyle's observations is depressingly true in this misbegotten time trap, there are those who, like Swann, not only notice but experiment, experience, research, and record their findings. Sadly, unlike Swann in his painstakingly researched psychic sexuality, most who write about these obvious but by most unobserved matters fall victim to several stylistic vicissitudes Ingo avoids. Their writing is dense, troublesome, obscure, becoming part of the problem it attempts to solve. Or their approach is so oversimplistic, pointing to obvious truths while omitting much of the data that fleshes them out, that they are readily dismissed as childish. Swann, by contrast, employs an engaging style while at the same time drawing on a vast store of data, personal experience, and deep reflection. He does not ignore the rules of reasoned argument, but instead imbues his text with the kind of fluid magnetic power he is elucidating, making his points simultaneously comprehensible and recognizable. As in, yeah, I remember that, or wow, I wondered what that was when it happened. Swann doesn't make the common mistake of confusing the menu with the meal. Instead, he rightly makes the menu function as it should, a guide to a gustatory experience, or in this particular case, a guide to psychic experience. Eluding the common trap of pursuing a point merely because it is trendy, Swann chooses to observe, record, and think the problem through. He writes from material that in general supports, explains, expands, deepens, and clarifies matters he has experienced firsthand and reflected deeply upon. In short, he follows the path of wisdom and, through his carefully constructed reflections, makes it accessible to the modern understanding. In chapter 12, Psychic Force as an Affluent Substance, Swann comments, the only real problem with the whole of this discussion is that modern sciences do not admit that this kind of magnetism or force exists. Unquote. He goes on to list a number of characteristics of the force taken from Spiritualism Answered by Science, 1871, by Edward William Cox. According to Swann, Cox was the person who coined the now generally accepted term psychic to refer to psychological abilities that transcend mechanistic limits. The list includes three characteristics I particularly want to draw attention to. Number one, there is a force proceeding from or directly associated with the human organization. Read organism or body structure. Red organism or body structure. Number two, The strength or power of the force is conditional upon the mental and emotional status of the individual and the individuals involved. The force, quote, is sometimes but rarely exhibited when the psychic is alone. As a rule, the presence of other persons promotes the operations of the force, unquote. Number three, the force is materially influenced by the electric and magnetic conditions of the atmosphere and of the surrounding bodies, by heat and cold, by moisture and dryness, and still more by the nervous conditions of the persons present. Here, the most significant aspect not of the psychic alone, but the spiritual as well is highlighted. He focuses our attention on the basic laws of magic, of ritual, and of transcendent consciousness. Upon reflection, one begins to realize why a social system that promotes and comprehends the true nature of human potential is so essential to our well-being as spiritual, psychic entities who indeed do not live by bread alone. True human consciousness, for that is what is being explored in Swann's work, is a byproduct of community. No rugged individualism here. For true consciousness depends on the interplay of a variety of human organisms coordinated into a harmonious whole. The psychic envelope, as I term the structure that arises out of the community, created by the linkage of human organic, magnetic, or psychic force, is dependent on its environment. Items such as weather, climate, season, placement on the planet, and within the constellations have direct impact on the clarity of any human operation. The location includes the group and its purpose as they relate to the sun, the moon phase, and tide. That is, to the general tone of the magnetic flow this vast interlocking energistic complex takes on in that precise moment. It also includes what time it is, as Native Americans put it. That is, the time-space continuum, which to the Native American philosophy is a time-space never-ending enfoldment, unfoldment, multidimensional helical interaction, and which is critical to all transactions among and within all communities in the universe. Again, everything depends on everything else, and nothing can act in isolation or independence outside of the infinite eternal confluence of energies, forces, and intelligences. If any of these aspects of the grid is off balance or out of tune, either nothing, something unexpected, or things unlovely and downright evil will be generated by this link. In other words, garbage in, garbage out. Love and beauty in, love and beauty out. Plenty in, plenty out. Peaceful in, peaceful out, and so forth. As one of the basic occult texts of the tradition instructs, for as ye sow, so shall ye reap. Sow the wind, inherit the whirlwind, and by their fruits shall ye know them. So various American Indian peoples hold that all life is a circle and everything within it is connected. That is what they mean by the evocation, all my relatives. In traditional American Indian languages, the sacred, that is, the higher integral energy field, which practitioners manipulate in their ritual manner, is known variously as Orenda, Iyanyi, Hobomak, Manitou, and so forth. In their study of magnetic fields in New England, James Maver and Brian Dix compare Manitou to their ancient Chinese geometric practice called Feng Shui. They write that Manitou appears to be inseparable from geomancy, the concept of the world as a place where all activities and objects, both in the natural and supernatural domains, are connected in some subtle manner. Geomancers believe that the natural order can be sensed and tuned by traditional practices, Native peoples' philosophical systems have long assumed that the use of this power, this orenda, hozo, hobomak, or iyanyi, this manitou, is subject to certain laws. For example, that it doesn't work for loners, except as a negative sorcery, the sort that blights, distorts, and destroys. In his book, The Manitous, The Spiritual World of the Ojibwe, New York HarperCollins, 1995, page 242, Basil Johnston, the noted Anishinabeg Ojibwe scholar, defines Manitou, defines Manitou. He gives characteristics of mystery, essence, substance, matter, supernatural spirit, anima, quiddity, attribute, property, God, deity, godlike, mystical, incorporeal, transcendental, invisible, reality. The community use of Manitou, Orenda, Iyanyi, Hozo, etc., that is, of geopsychic energy, however, results in an almost infinite variety of positive results. Many chronicled in reports on spiritual events in Indian country by travelers, antiquarians, anthropologists, and missionaries. Just about all of these both misunderstood what they saw and, either horrified or disbelieving, mischaracterized it. But there are those who have got it right. One such source is provided by Peggy V. Beck, an anthropologist, and Anna Lee Walters, Oto Pawnee writer, in their book, The Sacred Ways of Knowledge, Sources of Life, by the Navajo Community College Press. One of the many intriguing and points they make in their study of the American Indian system of the sacred highlights the means by which these geopsychic spiritual energies are used to benefit all life. The expression we are using to describe this power of prayer, dance, and song chant, and the concentration brought to an idea or thought by a lot of people at the same time thinking and praying for the same thing is collective mindfulness, they write. One is mindful when one is aware, respectful, careful. Beck and Walters provide examples of this collective mindfulness and include prayers given by native speakers such as this from a Winnebago officiant. Ancestors, we greet you. We greet you. You who sit around me here, we relatives, we greet you again. Soon the dance song will start up and we will try to dance and sing as did the Indians of old in the beginning. This was always an Indian ceremony, and in the old days, everything was done with the greatest of care and circumspection. All who were present had been blessed by the spirits. When it was time to begin the dance song, all arose and danced. As so much of this has crucial matters has been known for so long in so many civilizations, why don't contemporary authorities encourage all of us together to do whatever we do with greatest care and circumspection? Why not join in patterned, focused attention on psychic energies that surround us and manipulate them harmoniously for the planet and humanity's greater good? Maybe in that way we could transform the hostile, violent, fragmented, alienated, and sick energies we have been generating. The question must arise: who benefits from the worldwide transformation of essentially life-making force energy into that which is so powerfully negative that even the air can't survive its assault? In Psychic Sexuality, Swann explores many of the reasons why knowledge of basic life-enhancing processes is denied, even prohibited. He suggests that should we, the people, ever learn how to consciously amplify and utilize the psychic force that flows through us and through all that is, then all bets are off. Talk about power. Imagine the paradigm shift. I venture to say that the deepest cause behind most of the war, poverty, disease, and phenomena, both too vast and too subtle to quite comprehend, is lust for power. Distortion of human come planetary psychic force by oppression, repression, and suppression of our creative energy is the means by which we are locked out of our creative power. By distortion of creative urges, and chief among them being our own sexuality, we are prevented from making full use of the inalienable rights given to us by God and nature's God in order to secure the blessings of liberty with and for all the people of the world. For one thing, without the vital life-making force that nourishes sexual and all creative energies, no one can get turned on. No community could be formed, no learning could take place, and nothing would live. More than carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, and that which brings them into harmonious relation is the essential ingredient of all that is, organic or inorganic, animal, vegetable, or mineral connecting all that is into all my relatives as a fact, not a pious wish. How is it the poet Dylan Thomas named that energy, that force that drives the greeny flower? Ingo probes into many of the causes of officialdom's mindfuck. It boils down to who's to have power. Since about 1769, the industrial civilization of the Western world have, by regulating human creative energies, attempted to change, bypass, kill, or obliterate the obvious in the name of progress, in the name of empire, in the name of vested interests, both religious and secular, in the name of science as only materialism, and in the name of formalism and uniformitarianism. Now comes Ingo Swann, just in time to make best use of the energetic potential of what time it is. In the 1970s, he published To Kiss Earth Goodbye, then went on to train a group at the heart of the beast, rubbing its nose, as it were, in the obvious eventually. In the obvious. Eventually, his efforts resulted in their liberation, which each presently explores in their own bemused way. He offers Psychic Sexuality, a work that will help widen a path of reclaiming information about the obvious. At least the publication of this work gives us a fighting chance to survive the smoggy pollution that obscures the radiant vitality of all of this. Given half a chance, the human spirit, that is, the human organization or organism, harmonized with the time and the spirit of the time, with the vast magnetic interlocking quaternary of the great wheels, will break free from its chains. Together, knowing more of the magnetic interlocking, we might exit the deep cave we've been mucked about in for far too long and abandon our fascination with the chimerical shadows that masquerade as truth. Read Psychic Sexuality. Ponder it. Make it make its observations part of your experience, always remembering we are all part of of one another. Observe the obvious, the fruits, the effects of our efforts on ourselves and all our relatives, the change in you that entails the change in me and them and all of it everywhere. Find out what time it is, how the energies flow, and set sail. Begin now, and may the force be with you. Paula Gunn Allen, May 1998, Los Angeles. Paula Gunn Allen, PhD, is a professor of English, American Indian Studies, and creative writing at UCLA. She is a spiritual visionary and matron of Oak Clan, Laguna Pueblo, New Mexico. She's also an award-winning scholar and writer, author of The Sacred Hoop, Recovering the Feminine in American Indian Traditions, a novel entitled The Woman Who Owned the Shadows. Recent publications include Song of Turtle, American Indian Literature, 1974 to 1995, Life is a Fatal Disease, Collected Poems, 1968-1995, and Off the Reservation, Reflections from a Border Crossing Boundary Busting Loose Cannon. Introduction. As most people are aware, the topic of sex is composed of a vast panorama populated by multitudes of subsidiary topics bound together by an enormous array of associated activities. The whole of the panorama is then crowned by the mysterious life essential factor we refer to as ecstasy, but whose nature and place in the scheme of all things is not understood very well. In its bigger picture aspect, the topic of sex is so complex that it can't really be sorted out by relying on simplicities of smaller picture ideas about it, but some few seemingly permanent aspects can be established within any reasonable perspective. The foremost of these is that the mysterious ecstasy is the virtual hallmark of all sexualizing activities. For without it, interest in pursuing any sexual matter would decline dramatically. Another permanent aspect is the topic of sex perpetually outlives almost all other topics that the fertile minds of humans can invent and set going. Thus, while powerful intellectual ideas arise and ultimately deflate into faulty historical remembrance, the topic of sex persists in all cultures and in all generations. Yet another permanent factor is quite impressive. A very large proportion of human life depends on nurturing the inflow of knowledge with respect to whatever is involved. In this sense, much of life is stratified depending on how much or how little is acquired via intellectual understanding. But essential experiencing of sex and sexuality automatically arises from within each human individual. Thus, if all intellectual understanding about the topic of sex was somehow to be erased from societal efforts, the topic itself is refreshed anew each time a human is born, and in which individual will, for sure, commence sexuality experiencing. This is much to suggest something both confounding but wondrous, that sex and sexuality have a life and even a will of their own. My own interest in sexual matters grew out of the fascination of watching people undergo sexually oriented activities and contortions in the environments of my childhood. By the time I was 8 or 9, I understood that here was a topic subjective to impressive intellectual social control oversight. But just beneath its platitudinal surface, the oversight had high degree of inefficiency and failure, mainly because it sought to contain sexual behavior rather than perceptively address the issues of innate sexual forces involved. Simply put, and all things considered, the intellectual oversight was frequently no match for the sexual forces. By the time I was 35, I had accumulated a rather large library having to do with all kinds of sexual activities and various studies of them. Meanwhile, the age of sexual liberation had opened up, and so a plethora of new studies and books was suddenly available. But in the end, these these more or less emulated the contours of what had gone on before, and the sexual behavior continued to be the principal focus. But to me, then as now, the behavior resulted because of the sexual forces of or energies which stimulated the behavior into identifiable existence. Although the phrase sexual energies was broadly used, actual studies of sexual energies as real energies remained few and far between. Indeed, the modern West is highly deficient with respect to knowledge of sexual energies as really existing substantively. One obvious reason for this is that the topic of human energetics as a whole is either avoided or suppressed, and for reasons that are only partially explainable. Ancient Eastern texts, however, do not avoid the issue of human energetics, and many of them are in fact based on the real virtual existence of such energies. My first exposure to such Asian information came from attempts to comprehend the nature of the tantric arts and crafts, and which consisted of many different categories besides the sexual ones more commonly treated in the West. Tantras come from Sanskrit and literally refers to a loom upon which all things can be woven, and among which are enhancements of balanced sexuality, creativity, power, the achievement of desired objectives, and the attainment of 6 superhuman faculties. Most Asian texts stipulate the real existence of intangible, invisible energies that download into material representation and effects. The Chinese have long referred to these energies as qi, while the qi disciplines advocate understanding and working with, not against, those superlative energies. Basic knowledge of such energies downloads from pre-antiquity sources, usually referred to as shamanistic, and in this sense, some kind of operational knowledge regarding invisible energies is found in most pre-modern cultures worldwide. With regard to the modern West, most will not really be aware that one, the study of invisible human energetics really needs to flower into existence, and two, that it does not enjoy accepted existence because societal forces have suppressed it. As mentioned, the precise reasons for the suppression are vague and mysterious, but vivid and awesome elements of the societal suppression can be recovered from historical aspects, usually deleted from conventional histories, and in its a full part of this book to recover a sampling of those elements. But additionally, if the invisible energies do exist, as the ancient Eastern text holds, then they are universal to our species and as such will constantly be encountered even by those not knowledgeable about their existence. Such energies, including sexualizing energies, were encountered in modern psychical research, but they were concealed from popular knowledge because organized psychical research evolved smack in the middle of Victorian attitudes about sex, including even deleting the term from proper discourse. Then there is the matter of clairvoyance, via which invisible, intangible energies can be sensed or seen. It is with this matter of psychic clairvoyance that a large proportion of this book proceeds. There are many misunderstandings regarding clairvoyance, a rather recent term, but the phenomena of which are entirely consistent with the long history from the earliest forms of shamanism to the present, sensing or seeing invisible energies and their relationship to all other more concrete factors. It is quite clear that human power and creativity carry considerable energetic components to the degree that neither can fully be explained without studying and incorporating them. But in some sense, at least, creativity and power often are sensed only as potentials, largely because their energetic activation needs deliberate cultivation. The sensing of sexual energies, sex vibes, however, seldom needs deliberate cultivation. They are very broadly sensed in the raw, so to speak, among all humans, and sensed as distinct from physical, behavioral, and moral circumstances. Thus, while the sensing and appreciation of power and creative energies may require special cultivation, the sensing of sexualizing energies is flagrantly omnipresent and easily accessible to almost everyone. One of the benefits of this is that an examination of sexual energies can open a quite large intuitive door to studies of many other kinds of energies. During the early months of 1989, I was invited by Dr. Elmer Green to travel to the Menninger Foundation in Topeka, Kansas, to take part in a particularly interesting series of experiments. Elmer Green, together with his wife and coworker, Dr. Alice Green, had become widely known and respected during the 1970s in the realm of researching brainwave biofeedback and the image-making faculty. Their work inspired and energized the birthing field of biofeedback training, both to cure many ailments and to enhance states of consciousness. The use of biofeedback techniques resulted in an individual gaining voluntary control over many of the physical and perceptual processes. The Greens were a wonderful and dynamic duo, fully committed to discovering all they could about consciousness and its many phenomenon states. Elmer Green had taken his doctorate into biopsychology at the University of Chicago in 1962. Alice Green had done graduate studies in counseling and creativity. She later focused on exploring brainwave training in psychotherapy and had been the first president of the Association of Transpersonal Psychology. The Greens had established at Menninger a research facility referred to as the Voluntary Controls Program. The work of the program focused on the alpha theta brainwave biofeedback process, and was at first funded primarily by the National Institutes of Mental Health, constituting very high societal approval and support. Research progress led to encounters and wonderment regarding psychic physical energies and fluctuating states of consciousness. So within the voluntary controls program in 1983, the Greens incorporated a physical fields and states of consciousness research project. The concept of physical fields refers to the field-like magnetic and electromagnetic functions that interpenetrate the physical body and also extend outward from it. Within the physical fields projects, the Greens and their co-workers conceptualized a very curious and extraordinary research direction referred to as the Copper Wall Project. It was in this project that I agreed to act as an experimental subject. Because they are quite complicated and require copious background information, details of the copper wall experiment will be completely described in Chapter 18. But generally speaking, the copper wall experiment incorporated large sheets of copper constructed into the environmental surround within which an individual sits. There were two expectations. The first was that the energies radiating from the human body would impact with the copper walls, which were hooked into sensitive equipment to detect the impacts. The second consisted of the expectation that the copper surround would act in ways that might stimulate and increase extraordinary states of awareness and consciousness. The idea of increasing awareness and expanding consciousness is not new or unusual, of course. On its surface, the idea is attractive and widely discussed, for the prospect has to do with unlocking human potentials. Thus, the idea seems logical and is one that might be pursued with enthusiasm. But just beneath the glowing surface aspects of the idea exists a rather curious history of mainstream societal repression that is quite difficult to explain and which has hardly ever been opened up for inspection. In part explanation, though, let us identify what might be a strategic reason. What might be perceived via conditions of increased awareness and expanded states of consciousness certainly will differ from what might be perceived via average or conventional conditions of awareness. So, although the general idea of increasing awareness and consciousness seems logical and attractive, there is the matter of what realities will be perceived if indeed such enhancements does happen. Here's something apparently quite problematical to all major societal concerns, especially if they are founded upon states of awareness and consciousness developed only in accord with conventional average. Since most social structures are quite rooted in conventional parameters of awareness and perception, if one begins to think about what might be involved, any increase of them automatically have societal implications. Most will recognize this kind of situation, of course, but it needs particularly to be pointed up that all forms of psychic perceptions encounter difficulties in this regard. Most forms of psychic awareness and perceptions can easily be said to constitute perceptual increases beyond the conventional average. As it was back in 1989, I sat in the Copper Wall experiment twice a day for 5 working days, each session consisting of 45 minutes. Exceptional dynamic forms of consciousness and awareness appropriate to them gradually began manifesting. This was very confusing at first, but over time it could gradually be concluded that the whole consisted of perceptions of various kinds of energies normally invisible to conventional perceptions. With continuous exposure to this kind of thing, the energies could be isolated into many overlapping but reasonably separate categories, with 3 of them seeming to be major sexualizing energies, with 3 of them seeming to be the major sexualizing energies, creative energies, and energies having to do with various kinds of human power. This book, of course, constitutes an extended consideration of the sexualizing energies, the importance of which has been quite strangely treated by societal concerns, especially those of the modernistic period. At this point, it must be clearly stated that in no way was the voluntary controls project at Menninger or the copper wall experiment set up to enhance perception of sexual energetics, nor did the design of or goals of the experiment have any foreseen or expected sexual concomitants in the minds of anyone involved, including myself. In explanation here, if we abide by the conventional concepts that sexuality has a lower order status and spiritual matters have a higher order one, then the Greens and their co-workers were entirely representative of the latter, and in very wonderful ways. But when, on my part alone, the exceptional types of awareness commenced, they gradually went from one, what might be expected, such as enhanced seeing of auras around physical bodies, or to two, what was totally unexpected, especially the perception of dynamic energies associated with creative and sexual activity. Part four of Psychic Sexuality comprises my tale of encountering various aspects of the dynamic sexual energies, and which are of such a nature as to test even the most vivid powers of fantasy. Indeed, so fantastic might the dynamic sexual energies seem that I would not make an attempt to present them herein unless corroborative and substantiating historical background could be located. Thus, under the rubric of tremulous pulsations, I reviewed this background as part one of this book in order to partially reconstruct a larger panorama, what is apparently involved regarding energetics not generally visible within the limited scope of conventional perceiving. This background history can be traced to many cultures in antiquity, but I enter into it during the Renaissance period, which some historians indicate as the early beginning of what later became to be known as the modern scientific age. There is an advantage to entering into the history at the Renaissance point. Not only does the research topic of human energetics become identifiable, but societal repressions of that research are quite well recorded. One of the detriments of the history is that in the modernist West, the topics of sex and sexuality became increasingly taboo during the 18th century, and the taboo slopped over into the 19th. Most of the general history we depend on in any official mainstream sense was compiled by 18th century historians who, because of the taboo attitudes, bleeped open frank references to sex from their volumes. Thus, except as they pertain to the procreation of family lines, the conventional historical overviews from antiquity onward are sexless. This has made it very difficult to recover information about how sex and sexuality were treated in earlier times and in different cultures. But outside of the pall of conventional modern histories, enough has been recovered by intrepid researchers to indicate that sexualizing energies, as contrasted to physical sexual behavior, were acknowledged as existing in antiquity. It is also quite well established that what we today would call psychic sexuality was often treated as having ceremonial, cathesis, and psychic implications. Cathexis refers to a ceremonial investment of libidinal energy in a person, object, or idea. Perception of energetics, invisible to conventional awareness, requires that human organisms possess faculties to sense or to see them, faculties that can become functional or awakened under various circumstances. This kind of seeing has been scooped into the general category called clairvoyance. That term is a rather recent one, having many nuances not immediately apparent. I utilized part two to sort through several of the nuances, thereby hoping to establish a wider comprehension of what is involved regarding the wonders of clairvoyance. I utilized part three to represent a picture of what happened to me in general as a result of sitting in the copper wall environment, during which lucidity, a super form of clairvoyance, turned on, and why extraordinary measures were soon required to turn it off. As already mentioned, part four consists of my tale of perceiving sexualizing energies, the whole of which was a rather mind-blowing but completely fascinating experience. End of introduction.